Puer, Aeternus by Marie-Louise von Franz. Chapter 1. Puer Aeternus is the name of a god of antiquity. The words themselves come from Ovid's Metamorphosis, and are there applied to the child god in the Eleusinian Mysteries. Ovid speaks of the child god Iacchus, addressing him as Puer Aeternus and praising him in his role in these mysteries. In later times, the child god was identified with Dionysus and the god Eros. He is the divine child who is born in the night in this typical mother cult mystery of Eleusis, and who is a redeemer. He is a god of life, death, and resurrection, the god of divine youth, corresponding to such oriental gods as Tammuz, Attis, and Adonis. The title Puer Aeternus therefore means eternal youth, but we also use it to indicate a certain type of young man who has an outstanding mother complex, and who therefore behaves in certain typical ways, which I would like to characterize as follows. In general, the man who is identified with the archetype of the Puer Aeternus remains too long in adolescent psychology. That is, all those characteristics that are normal in a youth of 17 or 18 are continued into later life, coupled in most cases with too great a dependence on the mother. The two typical disturbances of a man who has an outstanding mother complex are, as Jung points out, homosexuality and Don Juanism. In the latter case, the image of a mother, the image of the perfect woman who will give everything to a man and who is without any shortcomings, is sought in every woman. He is looking for a mother goddess, so that each time he is fascinated by a woman, he has later to discover that she is an ordinary human being. Having lived with her sexually, and whole fascination vanishes, and he turns away disappointed, only to project the image anew onto one woman after another. He eternally longs for the maternal woman who will enfold him in her arms and satisfy his every need. This is often accompanied by the romantic attitude of the adolescent. Generally, great difficulty is experienced in adaptation to the social situation. In some cases, there is a kind of asocial individualism. Being something special, one has no need to adapt, for that would be impossible for such a hidden genius, and so on. In addition, an arrogant attitude arises towards other people due to both an inferiority complex and false feelings of superiority. Such people usually have great difficulty in finding the right kind of job, for whatever they find is never quite right, or quite what they wanted. There is always a hair in the soup. The woman is never quite the right woman. She is nice as a girlfriend, but there is always a but which prevents marriage or any kind of commitment. This all leads to a form of neurosis which H.G. Baynes has described as the provisional life. That is, the strange attitude and feeling that the woman is not yet what is really wanted, and there is always the fantasy that sometime in the near future the real thing will come about. If this attitude is prolonged, it means a constant inner refusal to commit oneself to the moment. Accompanying this neurosis is often, to a smaller or greater extent, a saviour or messiah complex, with the secret thought that one day one will be able to save the world, that the last word in philosophy or religion or politics or art or something else will be found. This can progress to a typical pathological megalomania, or there may be minor traces of it in the idea that one's time has not yet come. The one situation dreaded throughout by such a type of man is to be bound to anything whatsoever. There is a terrific fear of being pinned down, of entering space and time completely, and of being the specific human being that one is. There is always the fear of being caught in a situation from which it may be impossible to slip out again. Every just so situation is hell. At the same time, there is something highly symbolic, namely a fascination with dangerous sports, particularly flying and mountaineering, so as to get as high as possible, from the symbolism of which is to get away from the mother, i.e., from the earth, from ordinary life. If this type of complex is very pronounced, many such men die at a young age in airplane crashes and mountaineering accidents. It is an exteriorized spiritual longing which expresses itself in this form. A dramatic representation of what flying really means, the Puer, is given in John Maggie's poem. Soon after the poem was written, Maggie died in an airplane accident. High flight. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung, high in the sunlit silence, hovering there. I've chased the shouting wind along, and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air, up the long, delirious, burning blue. I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark and even eagle flew. And while the silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. Pueri generally do not like sports which require patience and long training, for the Puer Aeternus, in the negative sense of the word, is usually very impatient by disposition. I know a young man, a classical example of the Puer Aeternus, who did a tremendous amount of mountaineering, but so much hated carrying a rucksack that he preferred to train himself even to sleep in the rain or snow outdoors. He would make himself a hole in the snow and wrap himself up in a silk raincoat. With a kind of yoga breathing, was able to sleep out of doors. He also trained himself to go practically without food, simply to avoid carrying any weight. He roamed about for years, all over mountains in Europe and other continents, sleeping under trees or in the snow. In a way, he led a very heroic existence, just in order not to be bound to go to a hut or carry a rucksack. You might say that this was symbolic, for such a young man in real life does not want to be burdened with any kind of weight. The one thing he absolutely refuses is responsibility for anything, or to carry the weight of a situation. In general, the positive quality of such youths is a certain kind of spirituality, which comes from a relatively close contact with the collective unconscious. Many have the charm of youth, and the stirring quality of a drink of champagne. Pueri Aeterni are generally very agreeable to talk with. They usually have interesting subjects to talk about and have an invigorating effect upon the listener. They do not like conventional situations. They ask deep questions and go straight for the truth. Usually they are searching for genuine religion, a search that is typical for people in their late teens. Usually the youthful charm of the Puer Aeternus is prolonged through later stages of life. However, there is another type of Puer that does not display the charm of eternal youth, nor does the archetype of the divine youth shine through him. On the contrary, he lives in a continual sleepy daze. That too is a typical adolescent characteristic, the sleepy, undisciplined, long-legged youth, who merely hangs around, his mind wandering indiscriminately, so that sometimes one feels inclined to pour a bucket of cold water over his head. The sleepy daze is only an outer aspect, however, and if you can penetrate it, you will find that a lively fantasy life is being cherished within. The above is a short summary of the main characteristics of certain young men who are caught up in the mother complex, and with it are identified with the archetype of the Puer. I have given a mainly negative picture of these people because that is what they look like if viewed superficially, but as you will see, we have not explained what is really the matter. The question to which my lecture is directed is why the problem of this type to the mother-bound young man has become so pronounced in our time. As you know, homosexuality, I do not think Don Juanism is so widely spread, is increasing more and more. Even teenagers are involved. And it seems to me that the problem of the Puer Aeternus is becoming increasingly actual. Undoubtedly, mothers have always tried to keep their sons in the nest, and some sons have always had difficulty in getting free and have rather preferred to continue to enjoy the pleasures of the nest. Still, one does not quite see why this is in itself a natural problem, should now become such a serious time problem. I think that it is the important and deeper question we have to put to ourselves, because the rest is more or less self-evident. A man who has a mother complex will always have to contend with tendencies towards becoming a Puer Aeternus. What cure is there, you might ask? If a man discovers that he has a mother complex, which is something that happened to him, something that he did not cause himself, what can he do about it? In Symbols of Transformation, Dr. Jung spoke of one cure: work. And having said that, he hesitated for a minute and thought, is it really as simple as all that? Is that the only cure? Can I put it that way? But work is the only disagreeable word which no Puer Aeternus likes to hear. and Dr. Jung came to the conclusion that it was the right answer. My experience also has been that it is through work that a man can pull out of this kind of youthful neurosis. There are, however, some misunderstandings in this connection, for the Puer Aeternus can work, as can all primitives or people with weak ego complexes, when fascinated or in a state of great enthusiasm. Then he can work 24 hours at a stretch or even longer until he breaks down. But what he cannot do is to work on a dreary, rainy morning when work is boring and one has to kick oneself into it. That is the one thing the Puer Aeternus usually cannot manage, and will use any kind of excuse to avoid. Analysis of a Puer Aeternus sooner or later always comes up against this problem. It is only when the ego has become sufficiently strengthened that the problem can be overcome, and the possibility of sticking to the work is given. Naturally, though one knows the goal, every individual case is different. Personally, I have not found that it is much good just preaching to people that they should work, for they simply get angry and walk off. As far as I have seen, the unconscious generally tries to produce a compromise, namely to indicate the direction in which there might be some enthusiasm, or where the psychological energy would flow naturally. For it is, of course, easier to train oneself to work in a direction supported by one's instinct. That is not quite so hard as working completely uphill in opposition to your own flow of energy. Therefore, it is usually advisable to wait a while, find out where the natural flow of interest and energy lies, and then try to get the man to work there. But in every field of work, there always comes the time when routine must be faced. All work, even creative work, contains a certain amount of boring routine, which is where the Puer Aeternus escapes and comes to the conclusion again that this is not it. In such moments, if one is supported by the unconscious dreams, generally occur which show that one should push on through the obstacle. If that succeeds, then the battle is won. In a letter, Jung says about the Puer, I consider the Puer Aeternus attitude an unavoidable I consider the Puer Aeternus attitude an unavoidable evil. Identity with the Puer signifies a psychological puerility that could do nothing better than outgrow itself. It always leads to external blows of fate, which show the need for another attitude. But reason accomplishes nothing, because the Puer Aeternus is always an agent of destiny. In order to get into the deeper background of the whole problem, I want first to interpret A Little Prince by Antoine De Saint-Exupery, because it throws much light on this situation. This man, as you know, died during World War II in an aeroplane crash. He displays all the typical features of the Puer Aeternus, which, however, does not alter the fact that he was also a great writer and poet. His life was at first difficult to trace. In itself, this difficulty is typical. When you try to follow the biography, you can only collect a very few facts here and there because, as is already clear, the Puer Aeternus never quite touches the earth. He never quite commits himself to any mundane situation, but just hovers over the earth, touching it from time to time, alighting here and there so that one has to follow such traces as there may be. More information became available only several years after his death. It is well summarized in Curtis Cates' Antoine De Saint-Exupery, His Life and Times. Saint-Exupery, born 1900, came from an old aristocratic French family and grew up in a beautiful country house with its traditional atmosphere. He chose to become a professional aviator and acted for a time as a pilot for the Compagnie Aéropostale, which ran a service between Europe and South America. About 1929, he flew over the Toulouse-Dakar-Buenos Aires line and was also a collaborator in establishing new lines in South America. Later, he was in command of a completely isolated aerodrome in the North Africa desert, Cap Julie, for a considerable amount of time. His main duty there was to rescue pilots who had crashed from death in the desert or from falling into the hands of the rebel Arab tribes. That was the kind of life such a man would like, and Saint-Exupery preferred this isolated desert post to any other. In 1939, at the beginning of the war, he fought for France as a captain in the Air Force. After the collapse of France, he had intended to escape to Egypt, but for technical reasons, that plan had to be abandoned. He was then demobilized and went to New York, where he finished his book Flight to Arras. Later, when the Allies landed in Africa, he wanted to return to the Air Force. And though he was refused due to his age, he successfully used every conceivable ruse to fly again. In July 1944, having left Algiers with his plane on a reconnoitering flight in France, he disappeared without leaving any trace either of his plane or of himself. Later, sometime after the war had ended, a young German reported that he had been shot down over the sea by a German Fokker-Wulf plane. Out of a group of 7 planes, one man said that a French machine had been shot down over the Mediterranean. From the indications given, it would seem to have been Saint-Exupery's. Saint-Exupery's marriage was not a very happy one. His wife seems to have been very temperamental and sometimes a difficult woman, and he usually did not stay with her for more than a week or 2. Then, for one reason or another, he would leave again. When he was not allowed to fly, he always became depressed, walking up and down in his flat all morning until the evening, desperate and irritated. Only when he could fly, he became his normal self again and felt all right. When he had to stay on the ground and be with his wife or remain in some other situation, he fell back into these bad moods, so he always tried to get back into flying. His other books show how much he was concerned with present-day problems, and with the Weltanschauung of our time. Those of you who have read them will have noticed that, like many French people, especially those of the French nobility, he has quite a bit of Nazi psychology. The French are Franks, something one forgets because they hate the Germans so much. But the upper layers of society are often of German stock, which immigrated into France not so very long ago. From an historical point of view, and therefore especially in military circles and among the nobility, they have quite an affinity with Prussian mentality. Undeniably, this comes out in the characters of Saint-Exupery's novels. For instance, in Riviere, he tries to outline a Puer type, the cold man who sends his young flyers to their death for a higher purpose. This is just a part of the local makeup in his milieu, and not really relevant for his deeper problem, which is a search for ... But for what is he searching? That is a question which I will not answer now, but will try to find the answer to it with you. One of his most popular works, as you know, is The Little Prince. The book was a tremendous success and many people made it their Bible and worship. If you talk to them about it, however, they generally adopt a slightly defiant attitude, insisting that they think it a marvellous book. I have wondered about this defiant attitude, and I think the only explanation can be that even those who like it so very much have a small question mark in their minds. There is one question which I think one is allowed to put, even to its worshippers, and that is about the slightly sentimental style, a sentimental touch which, although it causes a certain malaise, does not detract from its value in other ways, even if one enjoys the book very much. Where there is sentimentality in general, there is also a certain amount of brutality. Goring was a typical example, for without qualm he could sign the death sentence for 300 people, but if one of his birds died, then that old fat man would cry. He is a classic example. Cold brutality is very often covered up by sentimentality. You see this cold masculine brutality at work in the figures of Riviere and of the Sheikh in Saint-Exupery's books. When we have interpreted The Little Prince, we shall examine some case material where this will become very clear, namely, in the shadow problem of the Puer Aeternus. Here, usually, is a very cold, brutal man, somewhere in the background, which compensates the too idealistic attitude of the consciousness, and which the Puer Aeternus cannot voluntarily assimilate. For example, in the Don Juan type, that cold brutality comes out every time he leaves the woman. When his feeling has gone, out comes an ice-cold brutality with no human feeling in it, and the whole sentimental enthusiasm is projected onto another woman. This brutality, or the cold realistic attitude, very often appears also in matters related to money. Since he does not want to adapt socially or take on some regular job and work, Yet he must get money somehow. The poor Aeternus generally achieves his purpose behind his own back, with his left hand, so to speak. He obtains the money, God knows from where, and in rather mean ways. If you touch the unconscious shadow problem, you get a complex, a reaction. Remark. Many of the aspects which you ascribe to the poor Aeternus could also be ascribed to the psychopath. What distinction do you make between the two? Quite a lot. But I would not say that the above is typical for the psychopath. For instance, the case I shall bring afterwards, a schizoid borderline type, is another variety. My experience is that beside the poor Aeternus, there is the man who is either the psychopath or the schizoid or the hysteric, or just slightly neurotic, depending on the individual case and what additional form the problem takes on. Let's say somebody has a religious problem. That is a problem in itself. But in addition, the person can be normal, or be a psychopath, or a schizoid, or hysterical about it. The same applies to the problem of homosexuality, which can be combined with, or free from, other neurotic features, and can be linked with the time problem more or less closely. It seems to me to be a more paramount problem. Dr. Jung had a very interesting idea about homosexuality. That perhaps it is an unconscious compensation for overpopulation. Namely, that nature pushes this tendency in order to compensate for overpopulation, so that a certain number of people refrain from producing children. Nature might possibly employ such a ruse, and overpopulation is just now our greatest problem. In former times, there were no statistics, so it is difficult to prove anything by statistics here. We only know that homosexuality is now tremendously widespread. My father, who was an officer in the regular army in Austria, and who spoke quite openly about such things, said that in his time homosexuality was not a problem in the army, and that there were very few cases. Well, nowadays, as you know, it is a real problem and very widespread, particularly among airmen. I have been asked to say something about the poor Aeternus problem, as seen as the animus in women. I have no material on that, except for some single dreams, but I can say that in its basic structure, the problem is not different. It is just the same, but one layer deeper. You could say that with a woman, the animus always anticipates what she has to do later in reality. So the problem of the poor Aeternus having to come down to earth is analogous to what the woman's mind had to do later. It is only one step removed from the ego. Naturally, the poor Aeternus problem is always linked with the creative problem. And that is paramount in women's psychology. If she has a puer Aeternus animus, she generally has a creative problem. And the cure for women is unfortunately exactly the same as for men. It is also work, or it can also be having children. I remember the case of a woman who did not want to have children. She always dreamt about poor Aeternus anime figures and nature pinning her down to earth. The dreams wanted her to have children, which would be one of the main ways by which a woman comes down to earth. She is committed definitely to something and cannot toy around with this and that anymore. This applies especially to women who are more of the het era type, those who have a lot of affairs with a number of men and do not want to be pinned down. The child makes the relationship more definite, so that is one way which it takes the woman, and it is a lot of work to have children, very regular, sometimes boring work. Now we will turn to the interpretation of The Little Prince. The story falls into two completely definite parts, beginning with an introduction which is told by Saint-Exupery in the first person, like part of a personal autobiographical account, which it begins, once when I was 6 years old, I saw a magnificent picture in a book called True Stories from Nature about the primeval forest. It was a picture of a boa constrictor in the act of swallowing an animal. Here is a copy of the drawing. In the book it said, boa constrictors swallow their prey whole, without chewing it. After that, they are not able to move, and they sleep through the 6 months that they need for digestion. I pondered deeply then over the adventures of the jungle, and after some work with a coloured pencil, I succeeded in making my first drawing. My drawing number 1, it looked like this. I showed my masterpiece to the grown-ups, and asked them whether the drawing frightened them, but they answered frightened. Why should anyone be frightened by a hat? My drawing was not a picture of a hat, it was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an animal, an elephant. But since the grown-ups were not able to understand it, I made another drawing. I drew the inside of the boa constrictor, so that the grown-ups could see it clearly. They always need to have things explained. My drawing number 2 looked like this. So it's the same as number 1, basically a cross-section drawing, so you can see that there's an elephant inside a snake. The grown-up's response this time was to advise me to lay aside my drawings of boa constrictors, whether from inside or the outside, and devote myself instead to geography, history, arithmetic, and grammar. That is why at the age of 6, I gave up what might have been a magnificent career as a painter. I had been disheartened by the failure of my drawing number 1 and my drawing number 2. Grown-ups never understand anything by themselves, and it is tiresome for children to always be forever explaining things to them. So then I chose another profession and learned to pilot airplanes. I have flown a little over all parts of the world, and it is true that the geography has been very useful to me. At a glance I can distinguish China from Arizona. If one gets lost in the night, such knowledge is valuable. In the course of this life I have had a great many encounters with a great many people who have been concerned with matters of consequence. I have lived a great deal among grown-ups. I have seen them intimately, close at hand, and that hasn't much improved my opinion of them. Whenever I met one of them who seemed to me at all clear-sighted, I tried the experiment of showing him my drawing number 1, which I have always kept. I would try to find out, so, if this was a person of true understanding, but whoever it was, he or she would always say, "That is a hat." Then I would never talk to that person about boa constrictors or primeval forests or stars. I would bring myself down to his level. I would talk to him about bridge and golf and politics and neckties, and the grown-up would be greatly pleased to have met such a sensible man. So I lived my life alone, without anyone that I could really talk to, until I had an accident with my plane in the desert of Sahara 6 years ago. Something was broken in my engine, and as I had with me neither a mechanic nor any passengers, I set myself to attempt the difficult repairs all alone. It was a question of life or death for me. I had scarcely enough drinking water to last a week. The first night, then, I went to sleep on the sand 1,000 miles from any human habitation. I was more isolated than a shipwrecked sailor on a raft in the middle of the ocean. Thus you can imagine my amazement at sunrise, when I was awakened by an odd little voice. It said, "If you please, draw me a sheep." What? Then he meets the little prince. Now we have to conclude from this first part. It contains the whole problem in a nutshell. We see that he has never really gotten into the world of the adult. He speaks about its emptiness, its idiocy, and its meaningless. There is the talk about bridge and politics and neckties. It is true, but that is the kind of adult. There is the talk about bridge and politics and neckties. It is true, but that is the kind of adult world one rightly rejects. It is the persona emptiness, but he omits other aspects of the adult life as well. You see in the feeling tone of this first part that he means that the childhood life is the fantasy life, the artist's life. He believes that this childhood life is the true life, and all the rest is empty persona, running after money, making a prestige impression on other people, having lost one's true nature, so to speak. That is how he sees adult life, for he has not found a bridge by which he could take over what we call the true life into adult life. That is the great problem, I think, in a nutshell. Namely, how can one pull out of this fantasy life of youth and youthfulness without losing its value? How can one grow up without losing the feeling of totality and the feeling of creativeness, and of being really alive, which one had in youth. One can be cynical about it and say that one cannot have the penny and the cake. It has to be sacrificed. But from my experience, I do not think that this is quite right. It is justifiable not to want to give up the childhood world. The question is, how can one grow up and not lose it? The great problem is that you can drive people out of this childhood paradise and fantasy life in which they are in close connection with their true inner self on an infantile level, but then they are completely disillusioned and cynical. I remember once that I had an analysand who was a typical Puer Aeternus and wanted to become a writer, but he lived in a complete world of fantasy. He came over from the States with a friend, and the two decided that the friend should have a Freudian analysis and he a Jungian analysis. After a year, they would meet to compare notes. They went to different countries and met as arranged, and the young man who had the Freudian analysis said that he was through with his problem and was cured and was going home. Everything was all right, and he understood his infantile attitude towards life. He had given up his mother complex and other nonsense. My analysand asked him what he was going to do, and the other said he did not know, but that he must earn some money and find a wife. My analysand said that he was not cured at all. He did not yet know where to go. He knew that he would become a writer and had started on that course, but he did not know where to settle, and so on. Then the one who had the Freudian analysis said, "Well, it is strange. They have driven out my devils, but with them they have also driven out my angel." So you see, that is the problem. One can drive away devils and angels by saying that the problem is all infantile and part of the mother complex, and by a completely reductive analysis, reduce everything to the childhood sentimentality, which has to be sacrificed. There is something to be said for that. This man was, in a way, more cured than my analysand. On the other hand, it seems to me that such a terrific disillusionment makes one ask whether it is worthwhile to go on living. Is it worthwhile just to make money for the rest of one's life and get small bourgeois pleasures? It doesn't seem to me very satisfactory. The sadness with which the man who was cured remarked that with his devils his angels had also been driven out made me feel that he himself did not feel quite happy about his own cure. It had the tone of cynical disillusionment, which to my mind is no cure. It must not be forgotten that the atmosphere of a milieu in Paris, such as that in which Saint-Exupery lived, was partly very disillusioned and cynical. He usually moved in circles, which looked at life as being important when one talked of bridge and money and such things. Therefore he, in a way, rightly protests against it, clings to his inner artistic and total view of life, and is resentful and revolutionary against such adult life. One sees quite well how, in a subtle way, he mocks at the adult, and how to the point that is. At the same time, however, he does not know how to pull out of his childhood world without falling into the disillusionment of what he sees as the only value in adult life. If you combine this with the symbolism of the picture, the implication becomes even worse. The boa constrictor obviously is an image of the unconscious, which suffocates life and prevents the human being from developing. It is the swallowing or the regressive aspect of the unconscious, the looking backward tendency which grips one when one is overcome by the unconscious. You could even say that the boa constrictor represents a pull towards death. The boa is the monster of the night sea journey, but here, in contrast to most other mythological parallels, the swallowed hero does not come out of it again. The animal that is swallowed is the elephant, so we should look into its symbolism. Since the elephant was not known in European countries until late antiquity, not much mythological material is available. However, in late antiquity the elephant had great significance. When Alexander the Great went to India, he saw elephants, and they were afterwards brought to Europe. The Romans later used elephants in the same manner as tanks are used in modern warfare. If we read what has been written about them, we see that a great deal of mythological fantasy was spun around the elephant. It is said that they are very chaste, that they only mate once in a lifetime, and very secretly, in order to produce their young, and therefore, according to a medieval reporter, they are an allegory of marital chastity. Like the unicorn, the elephant also loves a virgin, and can only be tamed by one, a motif which points to the incarnation of Christ. The elephant is said to represent invincible fortitude, and to be an image of Christ. In antiquity, it was thought that elephants were terribly ambitious, and that if they were not accorded the honour due to them, they would die from disappointment, for their feeling of honour was so great. Snakes love to drink the cool blood. And suddenly the elephant collapses, which is why whenever an elephant sees a snake, he goes for it and tries to trample it down. In the Middle Ages, the elephant stood for a man who was generous but unstable and moody in character, for the elephant was said to be generous, intelligent, and therefore taciturn. But when he once gets into a rage, he cannot be appeased by sensual pleasures, but only by music. This all comes from the Polyhistor Symbolicus, written by Jesuit Father Nicholas Cousinus. He gives such funny stories about the elephant, having summed up what the antique idiom says, and then adding a little bit of medieval fantasy. Elephants wash very often, he continues, and use flowers to perfume themselves. Hence they represent purification, chastity, and pious worship of God. This shows that the same thing happened to Europeans who met the elephant that happened long before to the Africans when they met it. Namely, the hero archetype got projected. It is a great honour if a man is given the title of lion, but the highest title anyone can be given is that of elephant. It is considered to be far above the lion, which is the image of a courageous man of the chief type. For the elephant is the archetype of the medicine man or wise man, who has courage, but in addition wisdom and secret knowledge. So in their hierarchy, the elephant represents the individuated personality. Strangely enough, the European automatically projected the same idea onto the elephant and took him as the image of the divine hero, the image of Christ, outstanding in virtue, except for being moody and inclined to fits of rage. That is amazing, but those were two outstanding qualities in Saint-Exupery, so that it could be said to be an exact picture of this character. He himself was subtle, chaste, and to a certain extent in the sense of being sensitive in his feelings, very ambitious and very sensitive about everything affecting his own honour. He was continually on the search for religious meaning. He did not worship God, for he had not found him, but he was always on the search. He was generous, intelligent, and taciturn, but very irritable and inclined to terrible moods and fits of rage. So there is an amazing self-portrait in the elephant, and one sees the archetypal pattern illustrated in a single individual without even much difference. It can be said that the elephant is the model fantasy of the grown-up hero. Already, this model fantasy, the image in his soul of what he wanted to become, is swallowed by the boa, the devouring mother, and this first picture shows the whole tragedy. Very often, childhood dreams anticipate the inner fate 20 or 30 years ahead. This first picture shows that Saint-Exupery had a hero aspect, alive and constellated, and that this aspect would never quite come through, but would be swallowed back by the regressive tendencies of the unconscious, and as we know from later events, by death. The devouring mother myth should naturally be pinned down in connection with Saint-Exupery's mother. but since she is in a conspicuous position, I hesitate to comment on her too much. She certainly is a very powerful personage. She's a big, stout woman, about whom we hear that she has a tremendous amount of energy, is interested in all kinds of activities, and tries her hand at drawing, painting, and writing. She is a very dynamic person, and in spite of the fact that she is now pretty old, is still going strong. Obviously, it must have been very difficult for a sensitive boy to pull away from the influence of such a mother. It is also said that she always anticipated her son's death. Several times she thought he was dead and dressed herself in large black veils, such as French women like to wear when they become widows, and then she had to take them off again, for he was not yet dead. So the archetypal pattern of what we call the deaf mother was alive in our psyche. In our patterns of society, the deaf mother is something not openly acknowledged. But I got the shock of my life when I had the following experience. I had to go somewhere to meet someone, and at that place the house owner had a poor Aeternus son whom she had quite eaten up. They were very simple people. They had a bakery, and the son did no work at all, but went about in riding outfit. He was a typical Don Juan type, very elegant, and having a new girl about every 4 days. This young man once went bathing and carried his girlfriend out into the lake of Zurich. And in a classic situation, halb zog she in, halb sank her hin. Half drew she him, half sank he down, as Goethe would have put it. Both went under. The girl was saved, but when he was brought out, he was already dead. This I read in the paper, but when I came back to his house, I bumped into the mother, who was a widow, and condoled with her, saying how sorry I was when I heard of the terrible accident. She invited me in and took me to the sitting room, where there was a very big photograph of the son on his deathbed, surrounded by flowers, set up like a hero's tomb, and she remarked, "Look at him, how beautiful he looks in death." I agreed, and then she smiled and said, "Well, I'd rather have him like that than give him away to another woman." Ha! The great mother makes a religious cult out of her son, and then he becomes the dead Tammuz Adonis Attis. He replaces the image of God. He is really also the crucified Christ, and she is the Virgin Mary crying beside the cross. The great satisfaction is that one has an archetypal meaning in one's life. One is not just Mrs. So-and-so who has lost her son in an accident, but the great mother, the Virgin Mary, who weeps at the foot of the cross, and that elevates the mother herself and gives her sorrow some deeper meaning. If she turns to it in the wrong way, then it is like that. I was terribly shocked by what the woman said, but then I told myself that this woman had the naivety to say what many others have thought. Being a simple woman, she said it right out. It was better that way than to give him away to another woman. She was his wife. It seems to me that there must have been something similar in Saint-Exupery's mother. Otherwise, why should she always anticipate his death and wear black veils ahead of time? It was as if she knew all along that it would end like that. We only know that this terrible impersonal pattern seems to have penetrated her personal life too. Consciously, Saint-Exupery certainly had a positive mother complex, which always includes the danger of being eaten up by the unconscious. It is interesting that Saint-Exupery says that he always goes round with this picture and tries it out on people to make them understand. It looks as though he were not definitely doomed, as though there was still a hope and an attempt in him to find some understanding. If only he could find somebody who would ask him what on earth he was drawing, that it was dangerous and meant such and such a thing. He wanted understanding, but he did not receive it. I think that if he had gotten in touch Perhaps it is awfully optimistic, but if he had come into touch with psychology, something might have been done about his problem, because he was very near to finding the solution himself. But somehow, tragically enough, he lived in this kind of light French milieu, where there was absolutely no psychological understanding yet at work, and in such an atmosphere it is very difficult to get near the unconscious. Modern French civilization, for different local and national reasons, is particularly cut off from the unconscious, so that he probably never met anyone who could give him a hint as to what was happening in his psyche. The story then transfers to Little Prince. We have heard the part where Saint-Exupery's airplane crashes in the Sahara, where he meets the Little Prince. I will go on with the text. The voice said, "Draw me a sheep." I jumped to my feet, completely thunderstruck. I blinked my eyes hard. I looked carefully all around me, and I saw a most extraordinary little person who stood there, examining me with great seriousness. Here you may see the best portrait that later I was able to make of him. He drew him like a little Napoleon, by the way, which was an unusual idea and typically French. It means that he is seen as a potential hero, a great conqueror, and not as the childlike genius he really should be. But my drawing is certainly very much less charming than its model. That, however, is my fault. The grown-ups discouraged me. Then he goes off in the old way. Now I started at this sudden apparition with my eyes fairly starting out of my head in astonishment. Remember, I had crashed in the desert 1,000 miles from any inhabited region, and yet my little man seemed neither to be straying uncertainly along the sands, nor to be fainting from fatigue or hunger or thirst or fear. Nothing about him gave any suggestion of a child lost in the middle of a desert, 1,000 miles from any human habitation. When at last I was able to speak, I said to him, "But what are you doing here?" And in answer he repeated very slowly, as if he were speaking of a matter of great consequence, "If you please, draw me a sheep." When a mystery is too overpowering, one dare not disobey. Absurd as it might seem to me, 1,000 miles from any human habitation, and in danger of death, I took out of my pocket a sheet of paper and my fountain pen. But then I remembered how my studies had been concentrated on geography, history, arithmetic, and grammar, and I told the little chap, a little crossly too, that I did not know how to draw. He answered me, "That doesn't matter, draw me a sheep." But I had never drawn a sheep, so I drew for him one of the two pictures I had drawn so often. It was that of a boa constrictor from the outside, and I was astounded to hear from the little fellow greet it with, "No, no, no, I do not want an elephant inside a boa constrictor. A boa constrictor is a very dangerous creature, and an elephant is very cumbersome. Where I live, everything is very small. What I need is a sheep. Draw me a sheep." So then I made a drawing of a sheep. He looked at it very carefully. Then he said, "No, this sheep is already very sickly. Make me another." So I made another drawing. My friend smiled gently and indulgently. "You see yourself," he said, "that this is not a sheep. This is a ram. It has horns." So then I did my drawing over once more, but it was rejected too, just like the others. "This one is too old. I want a sheep that will live a long time." By this time, my patience was exhausted because I was in a hurry to start taking my engine apart. So I tossed off this drawing, and I threw out an explanation with it. "This is only his box. The sheep you asked for is inside." I was very surprised to see a light break over the face of my young judge. "That is exactly the way I wanted it. Do you think that this sheep will have to have a great deal of grass?" "Why?" "Because where I live everything is very small. There will surely be enough grass for him," I said. "It is a very small sheep that I have given you." He bent his head over the drawing. "No, not so small that, look, he's gone to sleep." And that is how I made the acquaintance of the little prince. Then Saint-Exupery says that it took him a long time to learn where the prince came from because he always asked questions and did not answer them. Slowly, he finds out that the little man has come down from the stars and that he lives on a very small planet. The miraculous encounter in the desert is in one way linked up with Saint-Exupery's personal life. Once he had had an airplane crash in the Sahara Desert, but was not then alone, as in this book, but with his mechanic Prevost, and they had to walk endlessly and nearly died of thirst. They already experienced hallucinations, some mirages, and were practically dying when an Arab found them and gave them some water out of his gourd. Later, they were rescued. Naturally, therefore, he uses this recollection in the story, but changes it very typically. Namely, his shadow, the mechanic, is not with him, and he is not rescued for the moment. But something supernatural happens, and there you see how the archetypal fantasy comes into the memory of the real life, that is, the hopeless and impossible situation, which in all myths and fairy tales is the beginning situation where supernatural beings appear. In many fairy tales, a man gets lost in the woods, and then find a little dwarf, and so on. It is typical that when someone is lost in the woods or on the sea, something numinous appears. It shows the psychologically typical situation where the conscious personality has come to the end of its wits and does not know how to go on anymore consciously. One feels completely disorientated, with neither goal nor outlook in life. In those moments, energy blocked from a further flow into life piles up and generally consolates something from the unconscious, which is why this is the moment of supernatural apparitions, such as we have here. It often happens in concrete situations that people have hallucinations of some kind. If the conflict and the blockage go far enough. On a minor scale, the dream life becomes very much activated. People are forced into paying attention to it. Then come the apparitions within the dreams. Generally, that happens when the previous form of life is broken down. When he experienced this crash with his mechanic, Saint-Exupery was already in the crisis of his life. He was in his 30s, and his flying was no longer quite satisfactory, but he could not switch over to any other occupation. He already had these spells of irritability and nervousness, which he broke through by taking on another flying job. Originally, flying had been a real vocation for him, but slowly it became an escape from something new to which he did not know how to adapt. Very often, one chooses some activity in life which for the time being is absolutely right and could not be called an escape from life. Then suddenly, the water of life recedes from it, and slowly one feels that the libido wants to be reorientated to another goal. One perseveres in the old activity because one cannot change to the new one. In such situations, perseverance in the old activity means regression or flight, and escape from one's own inner feeling, which says that one should now change to something else. But because one does not know and does not want to go in a different direction, one perseveres. When Saint-Exupery had this airplane crash, he was already in the beginning crisis of his aviator's life. Here the apparition shows what is meant. There is a marked parallel to the meeting of the Star Prince in Islamic tradition. I think it is even possible that having lived so long in the Sahara, and having made friends with a number of Bedouins, Saint-Exupery might have heard about it. The famous story is found in the 18th surah of the Quran, which Jung has interpreted in detail, which is in Carl Gustav Jung, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, Volume 9, Part 1, Collected Works, Princeton University Press, 1959, par 200, which Jung has interpreted in detail, of Moses in the desert with his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, who is carrying a basket with a fish in it for their meal. At a certain place the fish disappears, and Moses says that they will stay there because something will happen, and suddenly Khidr appears. Khidr means the verdant one. He's supposed to be the first angel, or the first servant of Allah. He is the kind of immortal companion who then goes along with Moses for some time, but tells him that he, Moses, will not be able to stand him and will doubt his deeds. Moses assures him that he will have enough confidence to go with him, but he fails miserably. Most of you know the story of how Kidder first comes to a little village where there are boats on the water, and of how he drills a hole in each so that they sink, and Moses remonstrates Kidder, asking how he could do such a thing. Kidder says that he had said that Moses would not understand. Then he explains that robbers would have stolen the boats, and that by his bringing about this minor calamity, the fishermen will be able to repair their boats and still have them, whereas otherwise they would have been lost. Therefore Kidder was doing them a service. But Moses, naturally being stupid, had not understood. Again, Moses promises that he will not doubt again and will not have rational reactions. Next, they meet a young man and Kidder kills him. Again, Moses explodes and asks, how could he do that? Kidder smiles and explains that the young man was on his way to murder his parents, and that it was better for him to die before he became a criminal and thereby save his soul. This time, Moses is really willing to accept the explanations. However, when a third similar event happens, when Kidder causes a wall to collapse, only to uncover the hidden treasure of 2 orphans, Moses rebels again. Finally, Kidder has to leave him. The story illustrates the incompatibility of the conscious rational ego with the figure of the self and its purposes. The rational ego, with its well-meaning intentions and thoughts, is absolutely off the track in relation to the greater inner personality, Kidder. Naturally, this famous story serves to tell people that they should be able to doubt their conscious attitude and should always expect the miraculous thing from the unconscious to happen. This is the same situation for something happens here that is absolutely contrary to Saint-Exupery's conscious ideas, which tell him that he wants to repair his engine and has no time. He wants to save himself with the old aeroplane and is not willing to go on with the childish play with the little star prince. On the other hand, he is very significant that the little star prince is the only one who immediately understands the drawing. He should be very pleased to see that it is his other side which really understands him, the first companion who belongs to his world, the childhood world he missed so much. He is impatient, however. He thinks that it is a nuisance and that he must get his engine into working order. And then something absolutely classical happens, the gesture of impatience that is typical for the Puer Aeternus. When he has to take something seriously, either in the outer or in the inner world, he makes a few poor attempts and then impatiently gives up. My experience is that it does not matter. If you analyse a man of this type, whether you force him to take the outer or the inner world seriously, that is really unimportant, for perhaps it depends on the type. The important thing is that he should stick something out. If it is analysis, then analyse seriously. Take the dreams seriously. Live according to them, or if not, then take the job and really live the outer life. The important thing is to do something thoroughly, whatever it is. But the greater danger, or the neurotic problem, is that the Puer Aeternus man caught in this problem tends to do what Saint-Exupery does here. Just put it in a box and shut the lid on it in a gesture of impatience. That is why such people tell you suddenly that they have another plan, that this is not what they were looking for. And they always do it at the moment when things become difficult. It is in this everlasting switching which is the dangerous thing, It is this everlasting switching which is the dangerous thing, not what they do. Unfortunately, but typically, Saint-Exupery switches at this crucial moment. End of chapter 1. Gee whiz, man.